How's it going, everybody? Jared from Heavy Riff Beer here. And what we're going to do today is make one of the pre-canned kit beers that are on the market. And immediately you might be asking yourself why. Well, to be honest with you, I've never brewed one. I started with the Brewer's Best kits 8 years ago. I graduated to all grain brewing, let's see, somewhere along the range of 6 years ago. I've brewed professionally in 5 different breweries in various capacities: head brewer, lead brewer, cellarman, bottling intern. So I've really run the gamut as far as my experience in the brewing industry, and I'm also opening my own brewery, Heavy Riff Brewing Company. I've also worked at the local homebrew shop in town under the title of assistant manager, and I currently still teach the introduction to brewing classes out there, as well as the intro to all grain brewing class. So that's kind of my background. And I wanted to give this a shot as I've got a lot of new friends that I've met through YouTube in the Brew Tour community, 17 Brew Crew community, that brew a lot of these kits. Some as supplement to the other styles of brewing that they do, some because it is the only thing they have really readily available. And I thought, you know, if I'm going to be able to talk about these in a responsible manner, in an honest manner, I should probably actually brew one, okay? So I've gone ahead and I've picked up the Muntons Premium Pilsner kit. This is the only locally available can kit in my area. This is also one of the freshest ones, as because of my connections with the homebrew shop, I was able to get this can only a week old, a week from their shipment. So I know this is very, very, very fresh. I know that this can of Breeze Pilsen extract is also extraordinarily fresh. I'm choosing to go ahead and bypass the instructions for the sugar additions, as I just don't see a reason to brew this kit not to the absolute best of its ability, so I can talk honestly about it. If I can't make it taste great or taste reasonably good with this really fresh Pilsner malt extract, then I don't see any way that it can be made well using other adjuncts such as sugar, high malt glucose, brown sugar, honey, any of the fermentables that's out there. So I want to give this beer its absolute best potential possible. I've also got about a pound of dry malt extract that's very fresh that will also be going into this batch, and we'll get to why I'm doing that in just a second. But you're also seeing the layout of a lot of the other equipment that I'm going to be using today. I've got a spoon, I've got just my small pot that I use for making spaghetti, I've got my can opener sitting in Star San. I use Star San, which is a no-rinse acid-based sanitizer for all of my sanitizing. I use powdered brewery wash or, OxyClean unscented for everything that I clean with. So there's no dish detergent, there's no sort of heavy abrasive chemicals or something that people can't get a hold of easily, like caustic or things like that touch any of my home brewing equipment. I've got a jug that's been cleaned and sanitized. I have a water filter that filters out chlorine, so I'll be using that to obtain all of my water for this batch. I've got a bottle of Star San and a spray bottle, of course. I've got my fermenter. This fermenter has been used one time only. It's very clean. I emptied it today, the batch that was in it. It soaked for about 2 hours with PBW, and then it was rinsed out with very hot water and left to drip dry. I've also got a little flask in front of me, and in that flask is some boiled and cooled water. And I'll be utilizing that for a process called rehydration of yeast. And that's another thing that we'll get to in just a second. But this, in general, is all of the equipment that you're going to need to actually do your first batch of beer. You can add a carboy for siphoning back and forth and some tubing and things like that. But in general, for right now, this is everything that we're going to need. So I'm going to put this down. I'm going to take a sip of beer. Love beer. And let's go ahead and tear into the meat and potatoes of this. I've got the instructions actually set to the side here. I wanted to read them fully, understand them fully, and from the reading that I've done on the internet, most of these can kits are brewed the same way. So the Coopers, the Brew Canada, there's Muntons as well. So I think there's a few others out there actually, but they're not that I'm really familiar with. So like I said, I was only able to obtain the Muntons Premium Pilsner. That's the only option I had. And it's actually a good thing because I think I would have chosen this kit anyway. And the reason why is because there's a lot of guys who start off, number one, brewing beers that are kind of yellow in nature. Not saying that's offensive. One of my favorite beers on the planet is Pilsner Urquell. That's a gold, yellow Pilsner beer from the Czech Republic, and I absolutely love it. And so this kind of becomes one of the go-tos for that because it does appear to be just kind of a light, easy drinking beer. And that in and of itself is sort of part of the first problem because Pilsner is a lager style of beer, and there are many different kinds of lagers, but in general you have to have lager yeast, okay? It's impossible, it's completely impossible to brew a lager with ale yeast. You can get Pilsner-like beers with ale yeasts. Kolsch comes to mind. Great German light beer made with pretty much all Pilsner malt. Uses a hybrid yeast. It's an ale yeast that's fermented a little bit cooler, around 56 to 62 degrees, and it produces a good amount of sulfur in the initial fermentation, which blows off. It matures quickly over 3 or 4 weeks, and it has a lot of Pilsner-like or lager-like qualities. However, it is still an ale. And when I crack the top of this, I get an undefined package of Muntons yeast, okay? I don't like that to start with. And I go to the instructions, and what does it tell me to do? Ferment this beer around 70 degrees. 70 degrees is ale temperatures. So that's my clue. They've given me an ale yeast, okay? So I'm not knocking you guys out there who are making this kit or a Cooper's kit or something like that and you're really enjoying it, but if you wonder why you catch flack sometimes for your videos, it's because you're not brewing a Pilsner. You're not brewing a lager, okay? You've brewed a blonde ale, and that's fine. It can be a great tasting blonde ale. But understand that. Do some research on lager brewing and what it truly takes. You have to have a bottom fermenting lager yeast. Pilsner is a type of lager. So if you've bought this kit, every time you've ever brewed it, unless you've changed the yeast, you have brewed an ale. What they have in here is likely Pilsner malt. Pilsner malt is a type of malt, a low kiln, two-row typically a two-row barley that's a Pilsner malt. But you can use Pilsner malt to make a lot of different styles of beer. You could make a stout with Pilsner malt if you wanted to. You could make lambics with Pilsner malt if you want to. You can make IPAs, double IPAs, you can make pretty much anything. And vice versa, I could take Maris Otter Pale Malt or American Two-Row Malt or British Pale Malt, and I can do lagers with them because the defining characteristic is the yeast, okay? Not to say it's to style, but if you're going to call it a lager, the process of lagering must occur with the correct yeast. And that's my first knock against this kit. It's immediately set you up for pseudo-failure. It might give you a Pilsner-like beer, but they're misleading you by telling you it's a Pilsner. Alright? So, the other thing that I hate about this yeast is it's 7 grams. 7 grams of yeast. It's not enough. Go to MrMalty.com. Read John Palmer's book. Go to White Labs or Y Yeast resource section of their websites. They'll talk to you about proper pitching rates. 7 grams of yeast in a 6-gallon batch of beer, even at a 1040 to 1044 gravity, which is what a lot of these kits are set up at, is underpitching. Underpitching leads to a lot of off flavors, cidery flavors, immature ester production, sweetness because you've overwhelmed the yeast that is in there with too much sugar and it just doesn't know how to process it. So I hate this. Okay, I truly hate it. And I know a lot of you guys are still having success with it. And if your mileage, you know, like I say, your mileage may vary. And if it's working for you, God bless you, keep on doing it. But I'm kind of a by-the-book kind of a person. I enjoyed reading the texts that I've read from people who are smarter than me, that have gone through the process more than I have. And I believe them because I've tried their practices. And I know that this isn't enough yeast, especially when you just sprinkle it on top. After recently reading the yeast book by Jamil Zainasheff and Chris White, I know that half the cells in this packet die as soon as it hits the wort if it's not rehydrated. So I'm down to 3.5 grams of yeast, which is severe underpitching. So we're going to take this yeast and we're going to throw it away. I'm just not going to use it. The one last thing I would like to talk about with, as far as that yeast goes, is I know from experience and reading on Muntons' website that the yeast that comes with this kit is their standard Muntons ale yeast, which is intended to be brewed with a portion of very simple sugars like these kits kind of call for, unless you're going to do the malt upgrade. So it's wanting simpler sugars because it can't handle all of the malt. And it will not ferment much less than 1020, 1018 if you're lucky. So what does that do to this kit? Well, if I've got a 1040 or 1044 beer, like this calls for, and I use all malt, and it ferments to 1020, what kind of alcohol production is that? 2%, 2.5%, maybe 3%? I love session beers. I'm drinking a 3.5% English bitter right now. Love session beers. But with lager brewing, or if you're going to call this a lager, you know where that puts you? Somewhere in the range of American light lager, especially with the corn sugar adjunct. And one of the purposes of, or a lot of the goals of brewing your own beer is to not brew adjunct-ridden light lager that has a good amount of residual sweetness, and it doesn't really have any hop character, and you know, it's kind of mellow and yellow and sort of nondescript. To be honest with you, what's the point? You know, it'd be cheaper in the long run if that's a style of beer that you like brewing, unless you just really like the process. It's cheaper just to go ahead and buy the 6-pack of Bud Light, Busch, Foster's, whatever your cheap beer is that you live, where you live. Okay, so now you can understand why I want to do this as best as possible. I'm going to give this the benefit of the doubt and say that when Muntons brews this beer as a Pilsner, as a lager, with their lager yeast, with this ingredient, but not condensed down into this can, when they brew it at their brewery, that this is a fantastic beer. And so I started, you know, looking for what this beer is about, the description of it. And all it tells me on the back is that it's an uncompromising blend of quality ingredients and that it's thirst quenching. Well, what hops are in this? What malt is in this? Doesn't tell you. What style of Pilsner is this? Is this a Czech Pilsner? Is this a Bohemian Pilsner? Is this sort of, you know, because this comes from England, is this sort of, you know, an English brewer's take on the Pilsner style? Is this American style Pilsner or lager, something like that? Or, you know, something else entirely? Give me some direction. Let me know what I'm drinking. Help me understand what this is before I consume it, so I can better talk about it and get people more interested and excited about it. And because I can't do that, it's like, well, what direction do I go with this? You know, what yeast would I purchase as an upgrade to make this beer? And they don't tell you.